So good evening and thank you for joining tonight. Welcome to RIPIN's webinar, Differences Between IEPs and 504 Plans in Rhode Island's Education System. My name is Abby Herber and I will be your facilitator for tonight. RIPIN has been helping Rhode Islanders for over 30 years to navigate healthcare, special education, and healthy aging. We operate in a peer model, meaning when you call us, the person who answers has personal experience in caring for a loved one with special needs. You can reach us with questions around these issues at 401-270-0101 or at info@ripin.org. And I'll put this information in the chat later on. A few housekeeping items for tonight. We will be recording this presentation for training purposes. If you do have a question, please type it in and our presenters will answer them throughout the webinar tonight. We do request that when asking questions, be sure to leave out any identifying information, such as a student's name or school. And I would like to introduce our presenters for this evening. We have Ann Fratura, Katie Conti, and Lisa Tone Silva. All right. Now, I just want to briefly outline what we're going to go over tonight. First, we're going to discuss the basic differences between IEPs and 504 plans. We're also briefly going to go over the legal framework behind both of these and how they differ. And then we will go into the development and how both of these plans are implemented and developed by the teams. We will definitely go over eligibility and evaluation processes and how that may differ. And then lastly, we'll briefly go over dispute resolution options and what they are and how they differ for both IEPs in special education and 504.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. So we're going to start with an overview of IEPs and 504 plans. And starting with the most basic differences or their definitions. So an IEP is a personalized plan for students with disabilities, and it outlines the special education services and supports that they'll need to succeed in school. It's a legally binding document that's developed, reviewed, and revised annually by a team of educators, parents, and other professionals. On the other hand, a 504 plan is developed for students with disabilities under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It ensures that students with disabilities have equal access to education by removing barriers through accommodations and related services. So I'm going to give you a little overview, and really actually I'm going to give you a couple of different scenarios. So just to outline or highlight the differences between these two plans. So key differences: IEPs provide specialized instruction and 504 plans provide access. So here's a scenario involving an IEP plan. So Sarah is a 5th grade student with dyslexia. Her IEP includes goals and the delivery of specialized instruction for working towards attaining grade level goals or grade level reading skills, as well as accommodations such as extended time on tests, access to audiobooks. Now, her IEP team meets annually, might meet more than once, but at least annually to review Sarah's progress and make any necessary adjustments to her plan. On the other hand, Grace has an auditory processing disorder and a 504 plan. So while she doesn't require specialized instruction, she needs access to a social worker and an FM system to have equal access to her free and appropriate public education.
Okay, so now we're going to just talk briefly about the legal framework. So for the IEPs for special education, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA, governs IEPs, and it ensures that students with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. Again, that FAPE that Ann mentioned. And it provides guidelines for the provisions of special education. The 504, on the other hand, is governed by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. and this act prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities in federally funded programs, which include schools. These laws ensure that children with disabilities, regardless of their abilities, have access to their education. And a key takeaway here is that both the IEP and 504 plan are legally binding documents, and as Anne mentioned, that provide legal protection for students with disabilities. Okay, so now as far as eligibility and evaluation, to qualify for an IEP, a child must have a disability listed in the IDEA that affects their education and requires specialized instruction. It's important to note here that educators and parents need to remember that education includes academics and functional needs. For special education eligibility purposes, the student's disability must fall under one of 13 disability categories listed in the IDEA. And we talk about these more in some of our other webinars. In contrast, the 504 plan is available to students with disabilities that substantially limit a major life activity. These activities can include things like learning, walking, listening, speaking, and even focusing. So both plans do require an evaluation process and/or data collection in order to determine eligibility and the student's educational needs. It's also important to note that good grades do not mean that a student has equal access. They still may need a 504 plan to remove a barrier. And again, we're just going to briefly cover these. So that's it for this slide. Abby, do we have any questions yet?
We do have one question. So we do have a parent asking that their child has a diagnosis of ADHD, and the parent recognizes that he is struggling in school. He currently does not have an IEP or a 504 plan. Is there a particular avenue that they should be taking?
I can take that one. So, starting with the diagnosis, which is your starting place, as Lisa mentioned, as I mentioned, disability is the first kind of building block. So that recognized diagnosed disability is where you start. And you also mentioned that he's having difficulty in school. So there's some sort of barrier. Not every diagnosis doesn't necessarily automatically qualify every child with a diagnosis, doesn't qualify for IEP 504. There's still a process to determine eligibility for both. So writing to your school teachers, referring to the school team to ask, for a meeting to say, whether you need more evaluation materials, whether you need more data, and then determining what the supports are from there. So there's got to be that data collection that Lisa mentioned. The good thing is you don't have to go into this knowing which one will be what he needs. It's really then that you determine if there is this barrier to the education, does it require specialized instruction or not? I hope that answered. Anyone else? Lisa, Katie?
I think you covered it, Anne.
Thank you, Anne. We do have another question, if we can take it at this time. So we have a parent saying that their daughter is struggling with her 504 plan, and she feels that her accommodations might not be sufficient enough. She has requested a meeting with the team for the first week of school, and she hasn't heard back yet. So the parent is asking, who should she be reaching out to at this point?
Okay, I can take that one. So every district is different. Lots of times the principals in the building are the building 504 coordinator. Not always, sometimes it can be guidance depending on, the school and the specific district. But the parent should always, number one, keep things in writing. Try to avoid phone calls if possible. So send an email, and you can address that with to the teacher as well as to the principal. If you're still not getting an answer, every district also has a district 504 coordinator, and you can then take that step and go to the district level if your question or your concern or your meeting hasn't been scheduled. So that one, I think that was pretty basic. Anne or Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just add that while there isn't a timeline for how quickly the meeting needs to be scheduled, typically if you haven't heard back within 10 school days, that's definitely a time that you want to follow up and make sure that someone has received it and that they are working on getting it scheduled.
And I'll add one more thing. We always, like Lisa said, we recommend that people put your requests in writing, right? It's the best way to track timelines and to show evidence if you haven't or have even received a response. If you have made a phone call, it's not that phone calls aren't okay. Follow up with an email. That's like just as good. Phone calls are sometimes quicker, easier. Then you just follow that up with an email saying either I left you a message and I didn't get a response yet, or thank you for talking to me on this date. This is what I heard.
Yeah, that's great. And I would add that even sometimes you'll have those quick conversations in the hallway with the teacher or the principal, especially if there's any sort of action step involved. You definitely want to follow that up with an email.
Great point.
All right, thank you guys. That's all we have for right now, so we can continue.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look at how the IEP team might look a little different from the 504 plan team. So IDEA requires that an IEP team has to include at least one parent, at least one special educator, one regular educator, and then also someone acting as what's called the LEA, or the local education agency. There's often other members of the team as well. It might be the school social worker or the speech and language pathologist. But those 4 members have to be at every IEP meeting. And the IEP team is there to basically develop the students' goals, determine what services and how much service they need to make their goals, and what accommodations that they need in order to make progress on their goals. The 504 plan team could look a little different than an IEP team. It needs to be comprised of a team of individuals who have knowledge of the student. So there might be some similar members to an IEP team. It's likely to not have a special educator there, and it can look a little different. You still might have a parent, a regular educator, school social worker, or a different service provider, but it's really based on who has knowledge of the student. Another key difference is that while it's best practice to have a parent as part of the 504 plan team, it's not actually required. We do see that most schools and districts in Rhode Island do include the parent, but it's not actually required. So we just like to let folks know that. I think I covered it. Can you think of anything I missed there, Anna, Lisa? No. Okay, so what's going to look different in an IEP versus a 504 plan? So an IEP is a written document that outlines the students, it's formally called their present levels of performance, but really the students' strengths and needs that are determined on data, right? From evaluations, from classroom observations, the parents' report, that all comes together and they determine the students' strengths and needs. And from there, the IEP is going to outline the students' goals, the specialized instruction and related services they need to make their goals, and the accommodations that they need in order to make progress and access the curriculum. Once all of that is agreed upon, the IEP team, and it's going to be documented in the IEP, are going to determine the student's placement. Because the IEP contains goals, progress is monitored throughout, and the IEP also outlines when progress is going to be reported to the parent. This typically aligns with report cards. So if we do have any IEP parents listening today, when your kiddos' report cards come home, typically around that same time is when you should also be getting a separate progress report specific to their IEP goals. A 504 plan is typically in writing. However, that's also not required. Most districts in Rhode Island do put the plan in writing. In those plans, you're going to see the specific accommodations, sometimes related services that the kiddo needs in order to access their education. Another difference is that because 504 plans do not require goals or have goals written into them. There's no progress monitoring with a 504 plan. The 504 plan and the IEP do have those accommodations to make sure that the child has that equal access to their education. And that equal access also includes things like extracurricular activities, field trips, dances, any school activities that are available to non-disabled students. Okay, and then we're just briefly going to touch on funding and cost. There is no cost to families and students for any IEP services. Schools receive funding from the federal government for those services, state and districts. So your local district is also providing funding for those special education services. For 504 plans, there's no cost to families or, obviously students for their supports and the related services. But the funding cannot come from special education funding. It has to be through the general education funds. And do we have any questions, Abby?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. So first, we do have a parent asking, are districts able to deny a family's request for daily updates for their child who has an IEP?
I can take that one. Do you want to take it now?
Okay. No, go ahead. We can always.
If I heard the question correctly, Abby, the question was, can a district deny daily progress reports for a student with an IEP?
I think they said daily updates, so I'm not sure exactly what kind of update, but for their child who has an IEP. Yep.
So it's really based on what the student needs, right? And so sometimes we might see that what a school is doing to support the student with a goal also really needs to be replicated at home. Or that the student might be having a very specific, I'm just going to give example of like a social emotional struggle. And in order for the parent and the school to work really closely together to ensure the student is making progress, there needs to be some ongoing communication. And so sometimes we'll see something like a daily communication log written into an IEP. We'll also see that a lot for kiddos who might be nonverbal and not able to go home and express what happened throughout the day, what they worked on that day, that type of thing. Also, sometimes if maybe a service provider, for example, was out on maternity leave and the kiddo is owed something called compensatory services to make up some of that missed service. Sometimes the district or the school might agree to sending a log home of when they're receiving those services so that there's that documentation. So to say that they are always required to give daily updates, no, they're not. It's really based on the student's needs. But if there is a need and you can show that need, that's when we would see that a communication log, or sometimes they might call it a daily sheet. Sometimes they might be sending home behavior charts. Again, it's very specific to the kiddo's needs. That's when we would see something written into the IEP. Anne or Lisa, can you think of something that I might have missed?
I think that's a great way to say it. And I think it changes with different students' needs. Sometimes it changes as they get older, sometimes it doesn't. But I would say this almost kind of goes along with like effective communication and advocacy and partnership with your school team. So reasonable requests as far as sharing information is one thing. And what Katie is talking about is the other. So if this is a need, it needs to be put in as an accommodation or in an IEP because the student is nonverbal and things need to be shared. There's two different things here. So sometimes it just means meeting in the middle. The better you can communicate why you need daily updates, the more effective I think the partnership can be. Lisa, anything to add?
No, I think you guys covered it.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. We do have a couple more questions. So we have a family who their child goes to a private school, and the team at the school told them that their child would have an ISP instead of an IEP. Is that the same thing?
Okay, I can start, and I'd love if you guys chime in. So privately placed or parentally placed students in private schools, as they're called, are covered under the regulations. So there are still protections and regulations that cover this and what they are afforded. So an IEP is still developed in a sense, but it is provided through a service plan, or that individualized service plan, which is ISP. I'm going to jargon bust a little bit and hope that I got that part right. So it is, it will not necessarily look exactly like the services that would have been provided in a public school setting. However, it still has the same requirements as far as determining a student's needs. So that's the first step. There's still those steps in the process. So there's still it's still necessary to determine eligibility and data and gathering evaluative data and then moving on from there. So as far as the delivery of it, that's where the service plan comes in. Anything you can clarify for me, guys?
I think not really clarify. I'll just add that they do typically still outline those strengths and needs, like Anne was talking about, the goals, the service, how much service they're going to be receiving. Might not get in too much into detail into the accommodations, because the district providing the services in the private school really has no control over like what the kiddos' accommodations look like throughout the day. Usually the private school will write a separate plan for that, but they're open to kind of taking that feedback and suggestions from the team developing the ISP. But it can look very similar, and some districts actually use the same form. Sometimes we see that too, so that it looks exactly the same. Lisa, anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so.
All right. We'll take one more question at this time. I know we have a lot of questions, but we do have some more opportunities later on. But we'll take one more right now. So this parent said that their child was denied a request for a tutor during our IEP meeting because the school needs more time to get to know them, collect more information and data. When can this parent request another meeting?
So I can answer part of that. As far as requesting another meeting, a parent can request a meeting at any time. If at this meeting they provided a timeline, parents should have received a prior written notice as far as if they were formally collecting data, or if so, not really clear on that piece. But as far as the parent can request a meeting at any time, the tutoring piece, I'm not sure. Anne or Katie, can you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, tutoring is tutoring typically falls under regular education.
General education.
When a student is out for an extended time and isn't able to access the building, the school building. So I'm not sure how it's fitting into the special education or the IEP. But if you want to add that into the chat to clarify, maybe we can answer a little better. I mean, I do understand what you said about wanting to get to know a student a little bit better. So I'm guessing this is either a new school. When it's a new grade, typically you have the old teacher to get to last year's teacher to help a new teacher. So, but I don't want to assume too much. So if you want to give us a little bit more information on that, maybe
and I agree. Katie, I think you unmuted. I think you had something.
I do agree. And I was just going to add, um, sometimes, so yes, we typically see tutoring fall under general education when a kiddo has been out. Um, if if you were requesting the tutoring because you were feeling like maybe last year or even at the start of this school year, like your kiddo wasn't making the progress that you thought, or that they weren't receiving enough services to make their goals, um, but then the team was saying like, oh, we need to get to know them. So where that's coming from is that all those decisions about those supports and services are based on data. Um, and so they do need data to make those decisions. And and there are multiple ways to meet needs. So if your kiddo is struggling and the school says, oh, well, yes, we saw this, but we can't give tutoring because that's under general education. If you hear that, a great question you can ask the team is, okay, so what supports and interventions can we put in place?
Exactly.
What else needs to be added to the IEP? Do some accommodations need to be changed? So that's the way you can kind of continue the conversation and see what supports can be added.
Yeah,
The
that's
parent.
all I was going to add, that just the same thing, like tutoring is typically not in an IEP because it is general education. So exactly what Katie said, I agree. Like, okay, if we're not going to provide tutoring, then what other supports and services can we provide, or the frequency of them?
The parent did clarify that her son had missed a lot of school time last year and is transitioning to middle school.
So if they missed a lot of school last year and they're transitioning to middle school, the team might want to kind of get an idea of where he stands, what he retained, what he missed, and the best way to move forward. Um, and so I'll just add that if it's the IEP team isn't sure about the tutoring, because sometimes they're not, bringing in the special ed director can be really helpful. And that even though we were saying it falls under general education, and it is a lot of times the special ed director who helps arrange the tutoring. So that could just be a helpful person to bring into the conversation.
And missing a lot of school last year is a factor in maybe them wanting to observe a little bit, because there is a need to discern a little bit in this new setting. There's a couple of things going on. There's this new setting he's in, and also there's a need to discern whether or not how much of the learning loss came from not being in school, and how much is from the need for specialized instruction or the disability. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. So just asking everyone for that collection of data. So I think you're right on top of it. You're asking the right questions.
Perfect. All right, we will continue.
This is me. I shouldn't have muted. Okay, so notices are very important. And it seems like we get all kinds of notices all the time. And looking at them can really tell you a lot of information. So in the IEP world, notices are required by regulations to notify parents of an upcoming meeting. That's called a meeting notice. Now, that upcoming meeting is not just a meeting notice is not just to tell you when it is. We've had parents call and they say, I just got this piece of paper that says I have a meeting. I don't know what it's for. And a lot of times we can guide them to say, okay, it should tell you what kind of meeting. Some meeting notices will even tell you who's expected to be there. That's not a promise, if names are there or roles are there, but it will tell you, a lot of information. Schools must also notify parents about, upcoming evaluations. There's also a notice called a prior written notice. A lot of times that gets confused. That name gets confused with meeting notice. A prior written notice is actually something at the meeting that tells you that this action or change has been proposed by the team, and it's giving the parent notice that this is going to happen within so many school days. So it gives that parent kind of that heads up that if you disagree, you have these options to disagree formally. So it's important to note changes to the IEP can't be made without notice to parents. Now, in contrast, 504 don't have any formal notices. It's best practice to notify parents of upcoming changes to 504 plans. As Katie said before, as far as having parents present at meetings, absolutely best practice. But in the best interest of the students, sometimes changes are made to make sure that that student can access. And it's not required to have that parent notify ahead of time. Let's see, I think that's it for that page. Okay, now consent for evaluations, though, is a little bit different in the implementation. Now, consent for IEP evaluations starts a timeline. Their timelines are very, very important within the IEP process. It keeps things from lasting way too long and being dragged out. It really makes sure that that specialized instruction is going to begin as soon as possible, or the new data is going to be gathered as soon as possible. So parents must provide written consent, and those evaluations must be completed and a written report provided to parents within 60 calendar days. As far as how that evaluative data and then that IEP implementation, writing of the IEP is done, is that parents' concerns need to be taken into consideration. They're an equal member of that IEP team. There's actually a page in the IEP called the considerations page. And the very first few questions are all about need to be answered yes. There's no options for no. So one of the questions is, has the parents' concerns been taken into consideration? As far as 504, consent still must be provided for those evaluations to be done. However, there's no timeline set for evaluations. However, it is, again, best practice that those be done in a timely manner, aligned basically with somewhere along the lines of that IEP evaluation time. If you are concerned, if you have not heard when those evaluations might be done, when you might meet again, we recommend that parents keep that line of communication open and really say, when can we expect to meet again? I signed for that evaluation on this date. Can we set a date now to meet again to go over the results? Okay, that's it for me.
All right, and now we're just going to talk a little bit about frequency of review. So for the IEPs, that is required. The IEP is required to be reviewed annually. Sorry. And but IEP teams can meet when any team member has a concern, and that includes if the parent has a concern, they can call a meeting to review the IEP, as well as if a teacher or a service provider has a concern. And reevaluations for IEPs must be done at least every 3 years, unless all of the team members agree to a different timeline, which can happen. As far as a 504, these are reviewed periodically. So while reevaluations can be done for 504s every 3 years or when needed, there are no regulations stating that they need to be done at a certain time. Most districts will follow the same timeline as the IEPs, but again, they're not required to. And just want to note here that evaluations cannot occur in less than a 1-year time frame. So if they just had evaluations and 3 months later, the parent wants to have an evaluation done, you do have to wait that 1 year. Now you can do a different evaluation. So if they did an academic and an OT eval, but now 3 months down the road, you realize that there are some speech issues, then, you know, you can request that, but the same evaluation cannot be done within a year. And as far as outside evaluations, districts are obligated to consider outside data and evaluations. However, they're not obligated to accept all outside data and recommendations. They may accept some or parts or, you know, some accommodations or some recommendations, but again, they don't have to. Okay, so now a little bit about dispute resolution. With both IEPs and 504 plans, it's helpful to start with the school team first and then include either the special education director or the district 504 coordinator before moving towards more formal dispute resolution options. And again, it's, you know, starting with the teacher if there's a concern that might be addressed in the classroom level, and then maybe the special education teacher. And then again, as I just said, moving on to the special ed director, or for a 504 plan, in that case, the district 504 coordinator. But under IDEA, families have several options for resolving disputes, including mediation, due process, and filing a special education state complaint with RIDE, Rhode Island Department of Education. For 504 plans, families can use the district's grievance procedure or file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights, OCR. So each district does have to have their own grievance procedure or grievance policy that can sometimes be found on their website. But you can ask the building administrator, the principal, or the district 504 coordinator or the superintendent's office, and they should be able to provide a copy of that if you do want to follow that procedure. And while it's not required under IDEA or Section 504, Rhode Island now is offering facilitated IEP and 504 meetings. Do we have any questions at this point, Abby?
Yeah, we have several questions. We actually have a few questions that are somewhat similar. We have some parents asking about their child's 504 plan. If there aren't any regulated ways to track accommodations, how are we able to get updates and ensure that accommodations are being followed? And am I able to request progress reports for my child's 504?
I can take that one. So as I'm sure this is following on Katie's slide where she says it's not required to actually have a 504 plan in writing, especially. Now, as she said, most districts in Rhode Island do. However, we, you know, when we come across the situation, we do suggest that parents make sure that conversations that happen around what their student needs when they have confirmed with their school team that their student has a disability and that it is acknowledged that their student is encountering a barrier, as Lisa said, in one of those major life functions. They're putting that in writing and sending that in an email. So that's the confirmation that there is. And then those needs can be shared back and forth. And now as far as sharing, making sure they're being enforced. And I'm going to say that we know when things aren't going right for kids. We know when they're coming home, things are falling apart at school, they're having bad days, grades are slipping, something will tell you when something's not happening. Keeping those lines of communication open. If you want to make sure if there is a written plan, making sure that that plan is being shared with every teacher. I'm going to say, I do say as students are getting older, we should always be making sure that they know what they need. They don't have to know all the buzzwords. They don't have to know, I have a 504 plan. But we can start to get them used to certain words and they can grow into the appropriate lingo. But they do need to know what they need and they need to know that they're entitled to it to make sure that they're on an even playing field with their fellow students. Anything I didn't miss? I mean.
I think I'm just going to add that sometimes things are being implemented, right? Accommodations might be implemented and services might be provided, but they might not be working. So Maybe your kiddo's grades aren't as good as they usually are. Maybe they're coming home with a headache every day from having to try so hard to concentrate. Maybe your kiddo has anxiety and they're saying that they don't want to go to school. But everyone is saying is that all the accommodations aren't being followed. Those are all signs that something isn't working, right? Even if everything's being implemented, something isn't working. And so it's a great time to reconvene the team and talk about what do we need to change here? What's not working? And if your kiddo's old enough to kind of share, maybe it says they have preferential seating because of their anxiety. And they're saying, well, I am close to the teacher, but Johnny next to me keeps making lots of noise, and I think he keeps staring at me, and the kiddo behind me is always looking over my shoulder. Maybe preferential seating for them isn't the front of the room. Maybe it's in the back of the room so they don't feel like everyone's watching them. So sometimes things just need to be tweaked. And one other quick thing that I'll add, I apologize. Sometimes when things aren't being implemented, it's because they're not clear in the plan. They might be a little vague. And so it might say that Anne needs a movement break, but it might not say who determines that Anne needs that movement break and how do we know and how often, right? So does Anne choose when she needs a movement break? Does the teacher choose it? So sometimes things also could just need to be made more specific in order for them to be implemented well. So Lisa, anything you want to add?
Yeah, that I was actually going to say that, Katie, about making sure that the wording is very clear. And again, it also goes back to that communication question that we had. So, you can, especially for the littles, or if you have, a child that has anxiety, doesn't like to talk about stuff, maybe having that daily communication log or something that you work out with the classroom teacher. And again, as Anne said, as they do get older, sometimes there's other ways you want your child to learn how to self-advocate. So finding ways, making sure they know what their accommodations are. And just as a quick example, I worked with the family, and the young man, he was, I think it was like the end of middle school, and he had his 504 plan, a picture of it on his phone, so that he was able to say, oh no, look, it's in my 504 plan. I need a copy of those notes. So, again, just, making sure our kids know what they are entitled to, like Anne said.
Thank you, guys. We do have several more questions. We can take a few more at this time. So we have a parent saying that, at their school, there was a dramatic change with the staff and administration at the school. And they're wondering who is responsible for making sure to communicate to the new staff that their student has an IEP.
So I can take that quick and then you guys can chime in. So an IEP is part of a student's permanent record and their school record, and they have a case manager. So if Mrs. Smith is the case manager and she leaves, whoever takes over Mrs. Smith's caseload will be, the one who you should be in contact with, and they should be in contact with you. Again, I understand there's lots of changes going on with staff and administrators. But you can always reach out to the classroom teacher or the case manager that's written on the front page of the IEP. If that person is no longer there, you can contact the school. You can contact the main office, who, is Johnny's new case worker for this year, and then establish that communication. But the IEP itself, it stays in place. It doesn't, there should never be a gap. Those services are, every day while that IEP is in effect. Anne or Katie?
I would just add that for an IEP or for a 504 plan, sometimes even with all the best intentions and sometimes with minimal changes, things can fall through the crack. And so it never hurts at the start of a school year, or if your kiddo changes classrooms or they change schools for whatever reason, just shoot off an email to their teachers, saying, hi there, my daughter Grace is in your class. Just wanted to make sure that you're aware that she has a 504 plan or that she has an IEP and that her accommodations are clear. please let me know if you have any questions. And I know I've done that with my own daughter, particularly when she transitioned to middle school, because there's so many teachers that I was just really worried that communication wouldn't be clear across the board. And so that was just a way that I found helpful to make sure everyone was on the same page. And again, it's definitely not your responsibility, but it can certainly help things be a little smoother for your child.
Yeah, and I would just add exactly what you said, Katie, but in addition, especially with the 504, so an IEP, the team has to meet annually, so they have to meet, so they're going to meet at some point during that school year. But with the 504, again, it's periodically. So as Katie said, at the beginning of the school year is the perfect time to request a 504 meeting. If everything's going okay, like not the first week because things are crazy, but right at the beginning so that you can meet the team, the new team, and ensure that everybody's on the same page from the very beginning of school. You don't want to find out at the end of November that, you know, Mrs. Jones didn't know that there was a 504 plan in place. So I think that that's a good best practice on parents' part.
And I'll add one more thing, because you can't be sure that there'll be this full team for a 504. Asking, you know, that coordinator or that one teacher that might be there, how will you help me share this information with the rest of these, you know, the high school team, or, you know, the co-curricular teachers, or, you know, how can you help me share this?
Perfect. Thank you, guys. We'll take one more question at this time, and I know we have a couple more, but we will have another moment at the end for some more questions. So we'll just take one more. This child has a deficit in communication and currently does not have an IEP. From what it sounds like the student may be going through the evaluation process, and the parent is asking, are they able to get a communication log of some sort while they go through this data collection period? Is the district allowed to deny this request?
I can take that one. So I think that's a great question. And could they deny it? Sure. But I think, you know, asking the team in a meeting, or if you've already had the meeting and that's too late, you could certainly send an email, nice brief email, you know, thanks for meeting with me. Happy we're doing the evaluations. I'm concerned about what's going to happen in the meantime. I'm afraid she's going to fall further behind, or I'm afraid there's going to be something's going to fall through the cracks. What supports and interventions can we put in place in the meantime while we're collecting this data? And can that include a communication log so we're all on the same page, helping to make sure that you know, she's doing the best she can, or helping her move towards being successful? Something like that could be helpful. Anne or Lisa, can you think of anything else?
I was just going to say that this is the case with anything in while evaluations are being done. So anything you feel, nothing is being, you know, held in limbo while evaluations are being done. So it's still an opportunity to have different interventions and strategies be tried. So it's, no matter what it is you're hoping will be the eventual support, there's always questions about what could be put in for supports, because that's data in itself. If you're trying any interventions in the meantime, that's data.
Yeah, and I would just add, if the parent was literally just interested in the communication piece, that you can address that directly with the classroom teacher. They may be totally willing to, you know, they may have something, especially for, you know, some of the younger classrooms, they may have a communication log that they send home weekly or daily, or you could just use a notebook and send it back and forth, because sometimes it's beneficial for the teachers too, to know if Joey had a really bad night and he was up until 3 in the morning, and, you know, it might be a rough day. So again, you can initially address that with, if it's just for communication, with the classroom teacher.
Okay, so we're going to do a brief summary, and then I think we might have a moment or two for some more questions. So again, IEPs fall under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, while Section 504 is a civil rights law. A 504 plan is to remove barriers and ensure that a student has equal access to their education, while IEPs also ensure that, but they also are outlining specialized instruction. Eligibility for an IEP and 504 plan looks a little different. The composition of the IEP team requires certain members like the parent, the LEA, special educator, regular educator, while the 504 team just needs to have folks who are knowledgeable about the student. An IEP is going to include those present levels of performance, specific goals, outline the specialized instruction and services, whereas the 504 plan is going to include the accommodations and any supports and services the student needs to have equal access to education. Consent is always needed for evaluations, whether it's 504 or an IEP, and that there are different dispute resolution options available for both IEPs and 504 plans. And again, it's always best to start at the school team level. Any other questions, Abby?
We do have a few more questions, but briefly, I just want to point out a few takeaways to take away from this presentation tonight. It is important for families and parents to collaborate and work together to ensure students receive appropriate services. IEPs and 504 plans are equally supportive depending on the student's needs. And we have to remember that every student's needs are going to look a little bit different and require different services or accommodations in order to have equal access to their education. It's always remember that one plan is not better than the other. It's really about what does this student need, and it's going to look different for everybody. So we do have some time to take a few more questions tonight. We have a family asking, can the school district deny the family to the opportunity to review evaluations, decisions, or recommendations prior to a meeting? I'm assuming they're referring to an IEP meeting. Are the families able to request this information beforehand?
Me to take that one. So right now, there's no requirement for districts to provide evaluations and information before an IEP meeting. That doesn't mean it can't happen. And oftentimes, if families ask and teams are able and willing to share what is already put together, what has been, entered into systems, then they will. But right now, there's nothing that requires a district team to share that information before a meeting. There has been recent regulations and that will change that. It's just not put into place yet. So we are right now acting on current regulations do not require that. So it doesn't hurt to ask.
I would just add that sometimes the evaluations are not ready till like the day before.
Yeah.
And oftentimes schools might be resistant to give them out ahead of time because a lot of those reports include, I mean, I'm sure most of you folks here with us tonight have seen those reports with all those standardized scores that can be difficult to interpret. And so sometimes they'll kind of say, well, we want to make sure that we have someone at the table who can interpret that data. So that sometimes is the reason behind it. If they say, oh no, we don't share it. It's often not that they're trying to be secretive, it's that they want to make sure that everyone is understanding the data. But again, certainly you can ask. Sometimes it's helpful if you state why you need it. So if you say, I want to prepare my questions ahead of time to make the best use of the team's time, so that they know why, sometimes that's really helpful. Some parents might have their own disability like ADHD, and they might say, I really need to prepare and highlight some of it in order to be able to focus, or, my partner can't join us and they want to make sure that they have a chance to ask questions. So it's helpful. So sometimes if you're just upfront about why you need it, that can help the district, when making their decision to share them.
Thank you. And We have another parent asking about their child who has a 504 plan, but they are placed in a private school. What does that look like? Is it similar to an ISP? Is it called a 504 plan still? How does that look different in a private school setting?
So I can answer that one. So again, as one of us stated earlier, so 504's 504 plan is for federally funded facilities, which includes schools. So private schools do not have to put in a 504 in place. A lot of them do, and they will call it lots of different things, an accommodation plan, a support plan, a service plan. So it could look very different. It's not going to look like an IEP or an ISP. But every school is different. And again, and the district would have no input in that because 504s, there are accommodations for the student in that specific setting. So it only makes sense that that school comes up with those accommodations that that student needs. So while they don't have to put something in place, most of them will. If a student is struggling, it may just look different. So you could ask them, you know, if he was in public school, he would have a 504 plan. What would that look like here? And again, it's going to look different in every private school. Katie or Ann, did you have anything to add?
Thank you, guys. We'll take a few more. We have a family asking, their child has an IEP and they're wondering, will it continue through middle school and high school as long as he needs it?
That's a great question. And I think the key is as long as they need it, right? So some kiddos might have an IEP from the time they're 3 years old, and they might have it into, they can have it up to the age of 21, 22. Some might just have it till they graduate. Some might only need it for a few years, right? We're looking at kind of bridging that gap. And so it's really based on the student's needs. And that's one of the reasons why we have those evaluations every 3 years, is to collect that new data, make sure that we have all the information about the student that we need to determine what their needs are and do they still need that IEP? Do they still require the specialized instruction? Because for some students, sometimes at some point, really, they might just need accommodations. They don't need the specialized instruction anymore. Anna, Lisa, did you want to add anything?
No, I think the only thing I would add is just to be aware and actually read those progress reports for all of the goals. So you have an idea of where your child is at as you approach that next IEP meeting. So it's not, like you're not surprised if the progress reports are stating that they are meeting their goals. Then, and that's a good thing. It is a good thing sometimes, even though it's scary for us as parents.
And that's what I'll build on that. That's where I was going to go with the need, sometimes what we feel they need, and sometimes what the data will show, and sometimes don't always align. So that team is there for a reason, and it can challenge the trust and the partnership you might already have, but it really will come down to looking at data and looking at it as a team, and determining, so it is a team decision. You're part of that team as the parent, and you're an equal part, but it is part of it to listen to the other experts. You're the expert on your child, but you have other experts on that team with their own expertise. So it's difficult. It's not always an easy moment when we have to make those decisions, and sometimes we're on the right track and we know that there's more data we need to find, or that hasn't been collected yet. So
I'm just going to add, just because the parent specifically mentioned, like as they transition from middle school to high school, that because they're transitioning to a different school or a different level should not be the reason why an IEP would be discontinued. And those are definitely times where, as Lisa mentioned, you can always reconvene a team because their accommodations in particular or how they get their services might really look different once they're in middle school or high school.
All right, I know we are definitely approaching the end, but I do see one question would be really quick to answer, I think. We have a parent asking, where is the best place to find contact information for their district, their special education directors, and does RIPIN support the family in connecting them to their district?
So I can take that one. So each district first should have information on their websites. If you are not a computer person and you want to give a phone call, you can always call the administration office and ask who they should communicate with for whatever issue you're talking about, whether it's 504 or IEP. But websites are pretty much the go-to now. They have pretty much everything spelled out on on their sites. What was the second half of that question?
Is RIPIN able to help connect the parent to their district?
We do sometimes share the information as far as but I will say RIPIN is built on an empowerment model. So we won't make the phone call for you. We really feel you are your own child's best advocate, and you are the person that should be reaching out and asking the questions. Now, we do help families with the right, maybe helping find the right questions to ask. That's kind of where we seem to help the most. If you're not sure exactly what to ask, we might be talking with you about, so what are you trying to get to? What's your end goal? And we'll help you frame your questions. But as far as, making a phone call with you, if necessary, we've done that, but that's not usually the first step. We think parents are very, very capable and able to make those connections, but we are there to support them.
Yeah, I would just add that if the family was also meaning how could they connect to other families in the district? I'm not sure if that was what they meant, but each district is supposed to have a local advisory committee for special education. And that information can be, again, you can call the special education office at the administration building and you can ask for that contact information when they're meeting. And that's a great way to meet other families in the district, as well as some of the administrators. Some of the special ed directors and special ed coordinators do attend those as well.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. Please take a moment, if you can, to complete a survey for tonight's presentation. We appreciate the feedback, and I will also be putting the link in the chat, so you can access it that way as well. And then I know there were several other questions tonight. If we didn't get to you tonight, or if you have other questions at a later time, feel free to contact us at any time. If you're looking for support, if you're looking for some answers, please contact us by phone or email. You will also be receiving a recording of this webinar soon through your email. And previously I did put a link into the chat with our other webinars as well that kind of go into more detail on other topics. So that might help answer some questions as well. But we appreciate you all joining tonight, and I hope you guys have a great evening.